Okay, so today we're going to talk about life in colonial America. And by the late 1670s, roughly about 70,000 people had moved to the New England region of colonial America. And the colonial people had started to kind of establish their own colonial culture separate from England. Now, they were still pretty strictly British, but they started to create some really unique American ways of life. First off, in colonial America, as much as the case in England, there was a huge gap in wealth. The wealthy were always superior to the poor, and there was always a lot more poor people than there were wealthy people. Men were very much superior to women. Women had very little, if any, rights in colonial society, and whites were always superior to blacks. So one of the big differences in colonial life was clothing. Uh, Wealthier people wore brighter colors. They wore wigs, silk stockings, cuffs. Metal buttons were pretty popular back then. People who were less well off wore brown or gray pants and a white or gray or blue shirt, unicolors. So there's no like patterns in a less well off person's clothing. The wealthy people lived in these big manors or townhouses. They were filled with usually really nice furniture, typically from Europe. They had imported. The poor people lived in one room houses. They had usually sometimes a hole in their roof, a fire in the center, and if they were lucky, a bed or two. And usually those beds were simply just straw stuffed mats thrown on the floor. They usually all slept around the fire because that was the best way to keep warm during the winter and even in the fall and the spring. Church seating was a pretty easy way to tell who stood where in colonial society and colonial social status. The people who were richer and had more money sat closer to the front because they had more elect status than people who were poor. People who lived in the Chesapeake sometimes embossed their pews with like their family crest or their initials. They sat in padded seats. It was a lot more comfy. People who were slaves usually sat all the way in the back or stood. Men and women didn't sit on the same side of the church, they sit separately. So, colonial jobs. Jobs were pretty much readily available in colonial America, especially if you lived in big cities like Boston, Philadelphia, New York, or Charleston. One of the most popular jobs amongst young people was becoming an apprentice for somebody. So, if you were an apprentice, you essentially would report to a blacksmith shop or a carpenter shop, and you would learn that trade from a more expert craftsman, and then eventually you would move on and open your own business. Now, not all artisans opened their own business. Some of them stayed on and worked for their master craftsman as like basically a second person in charge, and it worked out pretty well. Colonial people really needed things made out of silver. They needed cabinet makers to install cabinets in their home, blacksmiths to make stuff out of metal tools. They need people to be potters to make pots so they can drink and transport food and water. They needed carpenters to help build their homes. They needed glass makers to make glass objects for them. One of the most scandalous jobs in colonial America was to be a printer, somebody who printed press or printed newspapers, because you could actually be arrested for printing material which bashed the king or government. And the best example of that was John Peter Zenger. He was a writer for the New York Weekly Journal. He was accused of printing scandalous stories critical of the governor of New York. He was eventually acquitted of all charges, which was a huge landmark victory for freedom of the press. Most people were farmers, most everyday colonists, middle and lower class. Their farms varied in size. If you lived in the South, usually you had these huge swathing cash crop plantations that grew things like tobacco, cotton, rice. If you lived in the North, your farm was a lot more small and you were usually self-sustaining. So you were growing food to actually live on and survive on throughout the winter and the summer. You'd grow things like potatoes and other vegetables. You'd raise livestock, goats, pigs, cows, etc. And New England farmers were pretty famous for being tough, thrifty, and really conservative. Ladies, unfortunately for you, you were legally dependent of men. You had no legal or political standing. You could not inherit land unless your husband had died and he had passed the land or the business on to you. On the contrary, men, you had nearly unlimited power in colonial households. You could beat their wives without punishment. That's where like the rule of thumb comes in. A man could essentially beat his wife with a thumb no thicker, or a stick no thicker than his thumb. And one of my favorite topics to discuss of all time are colonial elections. Little known fact, George Washington actually lost the first election he ever ran in because he didn't provide enough treats for his supporters. And I'll explain what treating is in a second. So back in colonial times, you would report to usually the town meeting hall to vote. Um, at the front of the meeting hall would be the candidates, and behind the candidates would be their treats. And essentially, the treats meant they'd provide food and alcohol for any person who supported them. And when I say alcohol, I mean things like ale, hard cider, rum, vodka, beer, etc., etc. And George Washington did not provide a whole lot of treats the first time he ran for office. He didn't provide enough food or alcohol, and he actually lost, which is kind of funny. When you come up to vote, it was not done by secret ballot, so you'd be called forward by the election official, and you declare your preference. And usually you chose based on who had the best stuff. So if Johnny had a lot more alcohol than Billy, you're probably going to vote for Johnny because you want more to drink after the voting process takes place. That's how colonial elections worked. They eventually adopted the secret ballot, and that's the way we run out, or the system we run on today. So lastly, we're going to talk about colonial education. Most colonists received little, if any, formal education. They were probably taught the basics of reading and writing their name, and that was about it. But New England was pretty famous for being a leader in education in colonial America. The Puritan settlers who first showed up there in Massachusetts Bay believed that every person should at least be able to read the Bible. So in 1647, Massachusetts passed a law which required every town of at least 50 people to hire a schoolmaster. And that schoolmaster would teach basic reading, writing, and arithmetic. Therefore, those kids could learn how to read the Bible and pass on the religious ideals of the Puritans to the next generation. So that's colonial life in a really short PowerPoint. We've also talked about other stuff involving colonial life. I hope you enjoy the show. Thanks.